come on in, everybody. We're getting people signed in the back of the room. Thank you for coming to this collaborative event that brings a lot of units on campus and initiatives together. I'm Kristin Kusanovich, the director of Turn, and this event is one of the headliners during Turn Week, where we collaborate with some really important centers and initiatives on campus. One of those is the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, where our speaker Irina Raicu is from and representing. And then the other is the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative, which has about 7 to 8 faculty and staff and many students involved in it. And today, Iris Stewart-Frey is the speaker from that initiative. There are many people that come together to help put on a Turn headliner. I want to acknowledge the Turn student crew that is all volunteer, and they and I put together this big week of 20 different headliners. This is one of the 20, and it is our first one of our Wednesday. So to begin with, we're going to do a land and labor acknowledgement. This is not the university's official statement by any means. This is written for Turn Week, and it was vetted by elders from many communities. So Turn acknowledges that at Santa Clara University, we work, teach, and study on the unceded traditional lands of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone. We recognize that U.S. public policy and church decrees have been used to displace indigenous communities, erode tribal nation sovereignty, and forcibly assimilate Native individuals into U.S. society. We at Turn, and all of us here, honor all of the indigenous nations and acknowledge the genocide against and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We affirm indigenous sovereignty and the living, resilient presence of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples throughout this region. Our labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who worked this stolen land for the colonists and who continue to disproportionately face economic oppression, racism, violence, and exploitation. We share these acknowledgements to encourage all of us here in the Turn Project to consider how our work and our learning in this space and in our daily lives can address these historic and contemporary atrocities perpetuated against all vulnerable people, especially Native and African diaspora people and communities. We invite everyone in this space to recognize their ancestors and the forces of history that brought you all here, as well as the work you are engaged in to support our collective liberation and the liberation of future generations, especially on behalf of all the leaders that we center during Turn Week, including, importantly, Black, Indigenous, and all other people of color who step in to show us how the future should look. Today, our topic is the AI explosion, and I can see by the number of people in this room that this is a topic that you are interested in. We're going to talk about what data centers are doing to one of our particularly vulnerable resources, a resource that we are primarily made up of, which is water. There are many things that data centers are doing, and there are many resources they are using up. Those will be touched on, but the main focus today is on water and AI and data centers. I'd like to introduce Iris Stewart-Frey, who's from Environmental Studies and Sciences, and Irina Raicu from Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, who will be discussing the sometimes conflicting needs for power and water in data centers, and then our desire to use AI and our need to use AI, and how these needs and desires and realities of energy consumption intersect with our vulnerable water resources and, more importantly, our vulnerable communities. So what are the options for conservation? What are some promises of greater sustainability that companies have made? And what are some of the regulations that are proposed regarding data centers in California? These two speakers have such a wealth of information on this topic. We'll be conducting this in a conversational style, so I'll be prompting them with a few of my questions. I hope my questions reflect the general question bank, but I'm sure that they will be incomplete, and so we have a time at the end for everyone in the audience to offer questions, at which point I'll just reiterate whatever you have offered and share it for the speakers and everyone to hear. Okay, so there'll be some time for that. If you're on Zoom, welcome, and you can put questions into the chat any minute of this presentation, and we will fish them out later. All right, so to the bios. Iris Stewart-Frey is a professor of water resources at Santa Clara University, where she's also the coordinator of the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative, EJ for CG, and a leader of the Water and Climate Justice Lab. And I know many of her students are here, her research students. Dr. Stewart-Frey obtained a PhD in hydrology from Stanford University and has conducted several studies on the impact of climate change in North and Central America and surface and groundwater quantity and quality in the Central Valley. She is currently working on a project researching the impact of AI data centers on California's water resources, and this talk benefits from that research. Irina Raicu directs the Internet Ethics Program. You should check that out at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. She is a certified information privacy professional, and her work addresses a wide variety of topics from online privacy to social media's impact on society, from the digital divide to the ethics of encryption, and the many ethical issues associated with artificial intelligence. Raicu was a member of the Partnership on AI's first working group on fair, transparent, and accountable AI, and she also served as a member of the initial cohort of the City of San Jose's Privacy Advisory Task Force. She has authored and co-authored a variety of resources published by the Markkula Center, including the compendium Ethics in Technology Practice, and together with other center staff, she has worked with multiple companies in the process of developing their responsible tech or responsible AI policies and processes. Her writing has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, USA Today, Forbes, MarketWatch, Slate, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Recode. She tweets at iEthics and is the primary contributor to the blog Internet Ethics Views from Silicon Valley. So both of these speakers have many, many publications, many ways of reading their work. So please look into their work. Okay, so Iris and Irina, welcome. So glad to be sitting with you today. I know we're a little low down here in these lovely comfy chairs. So we did put the screen up so that you could see a little bit of the talk a little bit better. Those of you on Zoom can choose any speaker's view at any time. We've got several cameras that you can choose from. So I want to just start with a basic question for each of you. What brought you to this work?
Iris, why don't you start? Yes, thank you so much, Irina and Kristin, and thank you, Kristin, for putting on that whole turn event year after year. Good morning, everyone. Looks like a great turnout. There are more spaces up front if you want to come. So what brought me to that work of the intersection of the environment and justice and water was actually an experience when I was in my teens and still living in Germany, and there was a huge chemical spill by a company along the Rhine River. And what I remember is how the fish then there were scores of dead fish floating down the river, and killing not only the ecosystems but also the affecting the communities around the river. And that was really something that made me want to go into the field of water. So fast forward a few years, when I was working on my PhD, I worked on pesticide leaching in the Central Valley, and it was all about the physical processes and how do we figure out how these pesticides, how do we model that, get to the groundwater. But the things that we didn't talk about at that time was, well, what's happening to the people that are drinking that water? And as we will talk about a little later, there are so many of them. So this has really been an inspiration to like figure out, what is the science and what can the science do to actually address those problems in the real world.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being here. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. I work at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and I have been working on AI ethics issues for many years now, long before ChatGPT erupted on the scene, and was already starting to read articles about how these massive AI models were requiring a lot of energy. Once ChatGPT did get released, we all started to focus on generative AI, which is a lot of what we're talking about now, but it's not the only kind of AI. So I wanted to say that researchers like Iris use AI all the time and need it for their work. We are not here to say that data centers are bad, AI is bad, and you should never use it. We are here to acknowledge the costs of that and to talk about the kind of ethical balancing that needs to happen. So I wanted to acknowledge in particular the work of two researchers, Dr. Sasha Lucioni, who works at a company called Hugging Face, and Dr. Xiaolei Ren, who's at UC Riverside, because they have been really public figures, and they've managed to talk to the media and raise these issues of the energy consumption of AI and the water consumption of AI. And that's where I first learned about them, was reading articles in the media, started to get more interested and to dig into it more deeply, and realized that I was going around talking to people about the ethics of AI, and the environmental impact was not even on the list of ethical issues that people were addressing. They were talking about fairness, and they were talking about copyright and data rights, but not about this overarching massive ethical issue. So I've been making it my business to make a lot of noise about that. And last November, we organized at Santa Clara University a day-long conference that was on AI's environmental impact and the common good. The videos of 6 panels from that conference are available on our website. And Iris was one of the people I reached out to who talked about AI and water, and been collaborating ever since.
Thank you for that. Yesterday's speaker, for any of you who were there, Dr. Ufwoma Ovian Hamada, she used the phrase resist detached datafication. And I really love those 3 words, resist detached datafication. And anyone who's working on environmental justice understands what that means, that you can't leave human beings out of the equation. They should be the center of your data gathering efforts, in addition to all the science and the engineering and the mathematical principles and other quantitative and other qualitative methods you might bring forward. I know the 2 speakers are deeply committed to environmental justice, and many people in this room as well. For people who aren't familiar with that issue or movement, would you, one of you or both of you, like to describe why or what environmental justice is and why this is an environmental justice issue?
Yes, so environmental justice is the concept that all burdens and benefits of the environment should be shared equally between communities, and equally and also equitably, and that that is a process that we need to work towards, and it involves being in conversation and supportive allies of communities, as well as putting our weights as academics or in Irina's case, public figures, behind raising awareness and behind the efforts to change policies to get to that goal.
Can I
Yes,
add to
please.
that? I wanted to add a quote from the encyclical letter titled Laudato Si, which you might have heard about if you are a Santa Clara student, in which Pope Francis wrote, quote, "Young people demand change. They wonder how anyone can claim to be building a better future without thinking of the environmental crisis and the suffering of the excluded." So the suffering of the excluded is what we're talking about when we talk about environmental justice. And not just the suffering, but the fact that there are better opportunities out there for better technology and for better AI that would be helping rather than hurting the environment. And we need to incentivize the development of that kind of technology.
And, if all the burdens and benefits of AI and anything else should be shared equitably, then the logical conclusion of that, unless any of you grew up next to a toxic waste site or a Superfund site, let's assume 90% of the people in the room here did not. The logical conclusion would be that we should all have more toxicity in our lives to share it more equally with people who have a disproportionate amount. And I bet that doesn't sound very good to you, or me, or us. So what does that mean? If equity would mean that we have a higher level of exposure to toxicity and worse quality of water, worse quality of food, lower quality of food, if that would be equitable, and you don't like that, then we need to get rid of toxicity. We need to get rid of things that are warming the planet. We need to get rid of unhealthy food conditions. And that's the work of justice. That's the actionable work. So if you want to think about the logical conclusion of environmental justice is everyone needs to be contributing to the good and solving problems. Otherwise, we're putting the burden, some of us are putting the burden on other people, even unknowingly. But now we're knowing after this talk. Nothing can be unknowingly done anymore. Thank you. That was a great explanation. Some people in the room might be just against data centers, just flat out, let's not build them. What would you say to people who are just saying, like, let's just not build, let's not develop? There's such a problem. Would either of you like to address that? Would just not opening any more data centers help this whole problem?
Well, if you like electronic medical records that you can share between your doctors, or if you like being able to communicate with people around the world, if you have family in other countries, if you like being able to do research, everything we do on the internet requires data centers. So we would lose a lot of very important good things that help everybody, including marginalized groups, if we didn't have data centers. The question is not whether we need them, but what we need them for and where they should be sited and what are the costs of the various data centers and how do we acknowledge that and build them better and not pretend that they don't exist. There's so much about what we worry about is the invisibility, the notion of the cloud that is in fact buildings the size of multiple football fields that require a lot of physical infrastructure that impact the communities around them. That's what we're talking about. And since we are in Santa Clara, I wonder how many of you would be able to tell me how many data centers are in Santa Clara? Anyone? I didn't know until about 6 months ago. Do you want to tell them?
Well, there is actually probably one student, at least in this group, that does know in his return. Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
60?
That is a little low. So an official database has about like 70 to 75 existing one. There is not like full information on all of them, and there's about 15 planned within Santa Clara County alone.
And just before we move on, but most of those are older ones and the kind of smaller kind of data centers. The ones being built now because of generative AI being integrated into every facet of our lives are called hyperscale data centers, and they are vastly bigger. They require chips that run much hotter, and they have very different cooling demands, which is one of the ways we get to the data usage.
So let's focus on water a little bit and these data centers and AI. What are some options for conserving water? We know water is precious. Our plant-based speaker yesterday explained to us that taking shorter showers is way less important than eating low on the food chain, because to produce a hamburger, it was the same amount of water as 100 showers. To produce a gallon of milk, it's the same amount of water as 200 showers. So really eating lower on the food chain is one of the best ways we can conserve water. It's a fascinating talk. For data centers, what can we do in data center operations to conserve water or not use precious, clean drinking water for what they need to do to cool things?
Yeah. So water use in data center comes from three different areas. So it's in the construction of the data center, and as you can imagine, that is temporary. And then, but also in the production of the servers and the chips that are in data centers, which often does not happen on site. But once the data center is up and running, the big water use is for cooling those data centers, because they're often running very hot and they need to be kept at very constant temperatures. As Irina was mentioning, if there is in the medical records or something very important stored that that cannot stop during a heat wave, or it cannot fail long term. So there is a demand for water in the data centers, and the type of cooling system becomes really important. There is one type that's called evaporative cooling that puts a lot of the water that is pumped out into the atmosphere and it is therefore lost. And then there's other more advanced systems that are called closed loop systems that would save more of that water, or there is a more recent effort to use also recycled water. So the options here would be to put data centers into places that require less of that cooling or less of that time, and also to use some of the more advanced cooling systems. The issue here is that a lot of the data centers are sprouting up in especially also the American Southwest. And that is, as all of you are living here, is an area that has a very long, hot, dry summer season, and will require a lot of cooling. And in California, water centers are especially clustered in the Silicon Valley here, but then also in Los Angeles. And water in these areas, in our area, is brought in from other parts of the state. So a lot of the water that you drink here is coming from the Sierra Nevada, which is a beautiful mountain range with clean water, and it's being transported across the state so that anytime we can turn on the tap and the water is coming out. But that water is transported through the Central Valley, a place that is hot and dry, and where there's a lot of irrigation and a lot of water that goes to that as well, and a lot of pumping from like deeper places. But then there's also communities, especially rural, historically marginalized communities, where people are not connected to a larger citywide water system, but they have small water systems, or they're dependent on wells, and they are drinking water that is a lot more contaminated groundwater, or their water is much more likely to also run dry, during the time of drought. So the idea of then placing data centers in those areas, for example, in Santa Clara County, one is being planned for Gilroy, one of these big, huge hyperscale data centers. And that part of Santa Clara County is dependent on groundwater, and it's a contained basin. We'd have to think a lot about how much water that data center is actually consuming, and what kind of water system, cooling system is being used, and if we should really site data centers in places like that.
So I'm hoping that some of what you get from that is that it's not just the amount of water that matters, but the location of the data center and also the source of the water. And these are often details that we don't have, that companies don't disclose even to water providers. So it's really hard to make, again, the kind of ethical assessment about what to do and how to make things better when we don't even have the basic information. But because amount matters as well, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context, some numbers. So this is from the 2024 U.S. Data Center Energy Usage Report, which was prepared by the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. They said in 2014, data centers consumed 21.2 billion liters of water. Hyperscale data centers in 2028, which is coming up pretty fast, are expected to consume between 60 and 124 billion liters. So from 21 to between 60 and 124, and think about that gap, the fact that we don't know if it's going to be 60 or 124 because we don't have the information. These are really key issues that we need to straighten out, and there's an urgency to this because, again, we are building data centers as fast as the companies can put them up in all kinds of locations. And to add to what Iris was saying, Bloomberg News recently reported that approximately 2/3 of data centers, new or in development since 2022, are in places already facing high levels of water stress. That's the term that's used, water stress. 72% of those are concentrated in 5 states, and one of those states is California. And because we're going to talk about regulation later, one of the things to keep in mind is that it's a lot easier to have an impact on state regulation than on federal. So I'm going to stop there.
Yes, remember that. Thank you. And, you know, there is some tension here between the precepts of justice and what's written about in Laudato Si, the encyclical on care for our common home, and innovation itself. I know we understand that we could do some things to green AI. I wonder if you have noticed any pushback on these companies that are proposing to move into places like Gilroy that have a contained water table that's very finite, where it's measurable how much water they have for humans and animals and trees and things that are already there. And it's measurable to, you know, that you can see, like it would be absolutely impossible to both give enough water to people and the new data center. Is there any pushback against a singular building project from outside a corporation or ideally within a corporation, realizing they shouldn't do that?
So
the idealist is speaking here.
Yes, within a corporation, that is really hard to find out. So Irina and I, we're currently studying specifically what is happening in California with data centers. And we haven't seen the same kind of, let's say, flagrant abuse of a community's water than some of the other examples from the nation that have made headlines. I don't know if you have heard about the Dallas in Oregon, where Google data centers were taking up to 1/3 of the city's community water, and the community wasn't even aware of that, and the numbers actually even only came out after a lawsuit, and after 13 months, during which both the company and the city leaders were actually refusing or pushing back on making those numbers public. There is right now, as of the summer, there is a pushback in Tucson, Arizona, where there is a big data center being planned, outside the city, and also has, as far as I understand, had been approved by the city without the community really being aware of that. And that parcel, I think it's like 290 acres, a $3.6 billion project, is will need some cooling water. It's a very hot and dry climate, and the agreement was that this parcel would be incorporated to the city to then be able to take some of the city water, and that has been very concerning, and the lack of transparency around that has been very concerning as well. As I said, we have not heard the same kind of egregious examples in California. We're beginning to study this issue, but the sheer number of data centers and the number of data centers that are being planned at least raise the question of, what kind of impact does that have on local water supplies? Where's that water coming from? And what are the reserves in the case of drought or other community needs?
Well, and communities might respond more if they knew more. That's part of what's happening. Looking outside the US, there have been demonstrations in the streets in Uruguay and in Chile and in Spain against the development of data centers in water-starved areas. In Montevideo, there was a planned data center at a time when the city was so short of water that it was adding salt water to the drinking water for the people. And then people took to the streets, and the data center was not built. So in some parts of the world, there's more urgency than in the US and than in California. But I do believe that part of the reason we're not getting the information that we need is precisely to keep communities from responding in the way that you're suggesting they could.
I'm definitely suggesting that they could. And I think that you mentioned a Spanish phrase to me that I remember the English meaning of it. The phrase, "Your cloud is drying my river," as a protest slogan.
That's actually the name of an organization in Spain. Yes.
Great. So remember that. I'm working with people from Afghanistan in Turn. They have a Turn Week in Afghanistan every October and every April, just like us. And it's all run by volunteers. 1,400 people belong to that organization in Afghanistan. In Kabul, the latest news is that the city of Kabul, which has millions of people, will be out of water in 4 years. Completely out of water. That's how fast things are drying up, and that's how hot things are getting. Afghanistan is one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries in the climate crisis. But that's how soon we're going to see humans running out of water in major metropolis-type cities. Given it is Afghanistan and they don't have infrastructure, they don't have any of their own electricity generation, they have to buy all of their energy from surrounding countries. It's very complicated. But just thinking about that, how could anyone propose a data center in Kabul with the knowledge that water for humans will be very hard to come by, will be only available in bottles in 4 years? And I don't know if you want to respond to that or if I'm just letting it hang.
I do, because I can tell you how many companies do justify the building of the data centers for AI, not in Kabul, as far as I know. And by the way, to go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, there are absolutely people working in all of the big tech companies who care about this.
Of course.
And who are trying to move things in the right direction. Some of you will be working in those tech companies and are looking forward to that. Please join those people in trying to address these issues. It's really important. But the argument that gets made is AI will help solve all those problems. AI will be what gets us out of the climate problems and will be able to even cite data centers better if we use AI to crunch all the data. And there is some truth in that. But then the question becomes, again, not do you build data centers or do you use AI, but where is it worth it? And right now, with generative AI, the kind of generated products or content that takes up the most energy and the most water are images and video. So, the new platform that was just announced, where everybody's going to make AI-generated video of themselves and their friends and post them for everybody to see, is the kind of AI that were being proposed that is vastly different than the kind of AI that would actually solve climate issues. And it costs more water and more energy to do those things. So knowing how to use it wisely, even if you're not one of the developers, becomes part of the equation here. Again, though, for that you need to know those facts. And it's something that we need you to share with all of your friends, right? Careful when you start playing with images. Careful when you start playing with videos. That's where you're really making the most impact. And where before, the vast amount of energy and water required went to training the models, now the latest estimates are that about 20% of that goes to training the models, and 80% goes to what's called infras, the actual usage. All of us playing with those free tools. 80% of the demand for energy is going toward that. OpenAI just announced, I think a couple of weeks ago, that they have 800 million weekly users of ChatGPT. That's just one model from one company. The platform called Hugging Face announced last year that they have 1 million models that they're hosting. So if you multiply all of those numbers and you think of all of your friends generating, whatever fun image and saying it's not, realistic enough or it's not cartoonish enough and doing it again and again and again, that's where we're getting to the massive impact that is really endangering all of the climate goals that even these companies have put in place, the climate goals of the state of California, the climate goals of universities, right? Because we're all being encouraged to use AI. So knowing how to use it wisely becomes really a key part of AI education.
And if I may follow up on the idea also of the companies, trying to be part of the solution, of the environmental solution. So companies like Google do have an interest in being sustainable and also being viewed as sustainable. And they're putting out sustainability reports, and each one of them, as Kristin was mentioning, also has research divisions to become more efficient and to become more effective, and also for their bottom line, but also how they're being perceived in the public. And I think that is also a leverage, this kind of information to hold them accountable for that. However, if you look closer at these sustainability reports, there is a lot of glossing over and generalization going on. For example, they're highlighting that they're restoring areas, watersheds. These watersheds, and I, reread that sustainability report in the last couple of days. These watersheds are not where the data centers are, and they're not taking that same water. And when they're talking about restoring billions of gallons, they're leaving out the little detail of where these billions of gallons of water are actually coming from. Also, Google has its headquarters here in Mountain View, just a little bit up the road, but there is no official data center that is listed under Google in the databases that that inform people how many data centers are in what location. So they're doing their business through apparently like third-party operators, and they might not be adhering to those same sustainability aspirations or standards that Google themselves does. So there is a very limited amount of actual information, although there is a lot of aspiration, a lot of promises that data centers will be all on closed loop, that they will be using all recycled water, but often the water operators, the water districts that are tasked with keeping water safe and keeping sufficient water in communities have no idea how much these data centers are actually using on a yearly basis. And when these permits are getting approved, there are estimates from these companies that later on are not checked. And so this is how things like the Dallas in Oregon happen, that it's only a few years later that people are going, oh my gosh, our water need has gone up, so many fold. And even in the, most optimistic picture within the Google sustainability plan, when they give the numbers for the last few years, the water consumed just between 2020 and 2025, so that's consumed, used up, has doubled for Google, for their sustainably operated data center. This is not the data centers that they're not listing in there. So it has doubled in just like 5 short years.
And I wanted to say on that note that we're not picking on Google. They actually disclose more than others, which is why we can say these things.
Yes.
A lot of companies tell us much less. But I would challenge you to go, you can Google the sustainability reports for Google or Microsoft or Amazon or other companies, take a look at one of them. And my challenge to you is find the numbers about water usage. Find where in that sustainability report you can get that data. And often, believe us, we've gone through, it's very hard and often it's not there. But you will get a lot of promises and a lot of very aspirational, hopeful talk about things that could happen in the future, which again is great. But in the meantime, if the water usage is doubling, then we need to stop doing some things. And one of the things that they're not doing, that they're not stopping, is inserting generative AI into all kinds of products where people didn't even ask for it, right? So the scale and the speed of deployment of these tools doesn't match the scale and the speed of the promises made in sustainability reports about how the watersheds will get replenished or where, or any of those promises.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Irina. What I wanted to point out is that even the best of these companies, or the most ambitious in terms of sustainability, how much they're still falling short of this transparency issue that we're highlighting.
This is such a great moment of consumer education in this session. And two main points I would just repeat or highlight are that companies are capable of greenwashing us, and that many companies at the hiring fairs at Santa Clara University will come up to you, the students, and say, we are so green, we are so sustainable, you should work for us. And they'll show you some statistic. You really should look into that, because they're also greenwashing you to get you to work there. So please look into that if it matters to you. As our guest said, they want to be financially sustainable, which means they want their bottom line to be successful, and they want to seem good. It's a whole different thing to be morally concerned from inside a company. And you can bring that moral and ethical societal level of morality into your work in a company. You can improve it from within once you get hired. But you need to know who's pitching their company to you and to what degree what they're saying is actually true. So I really appreciate that you'll be discerning. The other part is frivolity, I guess. The frivolous use of AI should be seen as a frivolous airline flight, frivolous air travel, frivolous burning of fossil fuels. There is a cost to our hypersense of self-entertainment that we have handed to us through our systems of capitalistic enterprise. So there is a cost. So you and your friends can decide not to use AI in frivolous ways, and that will cut down on that imprint. And that is a small thing we can all do. Even not sending email attachments that have pictures and videos also helps with energy. So there's so many things that we do that we need to unearth the actual ramifications of. And it can be overwhelming, because almost everything we do can have a hidden ramification, right? So it's good to know. It's good to know. In our last two questions, I want to cover something about the regulations and the policies that could make AI more sustainable. Would each of you like to talk a little bit about that? And then we'll get to what can interested students, interested people in general do about this issue?
Well, let me take the regulation one a little bit.
Share the slide in the meantime.
First of all, there were attempts at some regulation, federal regulation under the Biden administration. There was a federal law that was proposed that never passed, but mostly what it would have done is, additional research of the positive and negative impacts. And we know enough now to know that we need more than just more research. We actually need regulation that regulates how things are done. So in the absence of federal action, and we shouldn't go there yet.
No? Okay.
No, we're skipping ahead. So
Okay.
I'm still trying to say, talk about the regulatory stuff.
Okay.
Okay. In the absence of federal action, some states have stepped up, and it looked for a while like California was going to be a leader in that. We had a number of bills proposed. A lot of them, again, were just about transparency. because you can't really do even good regulation if you don't understand exactly what's going on. Some people say, and you will see claims all over the internet, that actual water usage is not really a problem, that it's nothing like, eating hamburgers or whatever. You're hearing some numbers from us that should tell you it's actually a massive problem. But if it's not a problem, give us the data, right? If everybody disclosed the data and it turns out it's no big deal, great, we move on and we talk about something more important. Without the data, we can't really do anything well. So in California, until about 2 days ago, there was the hope because there was Assembly Bill 93, which had made it through the various committees and was on the governor's desk, and it would have required data center operators to share with their water supplier. So initially, it was supposed to be something more public. But it had been whittled down to where what they would have had to do is share with their water supplier how much water they estimate they would consume when they applied for or renewed a business license or permit. It also would have directed state agencies to develop water use efficiency guidelines and best practices for data centers and for businesses to self-certify that they comply with them. So it was all self-certification, disclosure only to water suppliers. The governor vetoed it, declined to sign it. So we don't have even that level of transparency right now in California, which considers itself a leader in environmental efforts, right? Because the push is so hard that we need more AI and we need to be at the forefront. And so it's all about developing data centers. At the federal level, we've gone hard the other way, where it's all about building, where it's all about incentivizing the development of data centers on federal lands. This is part of a new executive order that was passed by President Trump, and there are requirements for agencies to loosen the permitting process so that we will speed up the permitting of more data centers all over the place. Again, that means the efforts need to be at the state level and maybe at the county level and at the municipal level and wherever you and I and all of us actually can pull some levers, including the consumer lever, which means, we can ask companies to do more even if the law doesn't require them to. But we really do need new regulation, and right now we're failing miserably at getting anything even as little as just transparency.
And if I just may add, it was very interesting to see Governor Newsom's justification for this veto, because it included nothing about the environment, and it basically boiled to, data centers are growing and we cannot stand in the way, which was lacking an incredible amount of nuance.
Very disappointing. Shall we move to what we can do? What are some action items? Would that be good? And then we'll move open to questions.
Sure.
Okay. So, what can people who are interested in this? We're all interested in this now. We know a little more after this time, and many of you are studying this, researching this, thinking about it. You have your own ideas too. What can we all do about this issue? And I know you have a slide to share, so I appreciate this. And feel free to take a picture of this if this appeals to you.
Yeah, so we've listed a bunch of different things because there are different stakeholders, and different stakeholders play different roles. If you are a lawmaker, you can push for more disclosure. But I think it's also important to note that lawmakers really need to partner with local researchers who understand the environmental impacts. AI researchers within academia can do more in turn to engage with lawmakers and the public beyond research communities. So you don't just have the internal conversations, you actually push policy and law. Include disclosures of environmental impacts at academic conference submissions, and continue to provide those key estimates that, again, all we know right now is coming from the kind of researchers who are doing that kind of estimate work. Businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies and universities that are being pitched AI products should ask about their environmental impact, favor companies that disclose accurate data, conduct a careful cost, benefit, and risk analysis, and then ideally audit that the promises are actually being kept. And then individual users like all of us need to demand more environmentally friendly solutions, choose products from companies that disclose their impact, limit our use of free tools that have a great cost, and please educate others who are not aware of the issues, because you would be surprised. If you start to know about this, you will see more and more articles about this, and you think, oh, this is really permeating into the general understanding. And it's shocking how many communities are still not aware of it. And I mean professional communities, not just local communities on the ground.
Yeah, I think that was our summary.
Great,
Good.
thank you. Okay, this is really good. I'm going to share a few questions that came in on chat, and while I'm doing that, maybe you could think about, if you're in the room here, if you have questions, and we'll just have you raise your hand, and then we'll reiterate it so that everybody can hear it in case they didn't. But Annie Yang shared a few resources. There's www.datacentermap.com, and you can put USA, California, Santa Clara. You can search information there. So she put that in the chat for anyone who's interested. And then great question from Chad. Challenging question, as I would expect from my incredible colleague, Chad. Universities like ours are enthusiastically training faculty and students to teach and learn with AI. How could we change our approach to teach people how to use AI like a scarce resource? For example, do dedicated AI apps for specific purposes use fewer resources than general purpose apps like ChatGPT and Google Gemini? Great question.
Yeah, so first of all, any university that cares about ethical use of AI should be including topics like this one into any kind of training of how to use AI. And to Chad's point, yes, there's now more and more push for smaller models that are designed fit for a particular purpose, as opposed to just these general massive models that are supposed to be good for everything. And using those smaller modules is much more environmentally friendly. So remember what I was saying, there's a lot of room for innovation if you understand the need for this. And there's similarly a lot of room for education as you're teaching people, and it's important for all of us to understand how AI works and how we might use it. And by the way, that how it works should come before how to use it. And right now, that's not how it goes, right? Everybody's being told, you need to know how to use it. It's really important. You're going to fall behind. And you don't really understand what it is that you're using. If we understood a little bit of the basics of what these tools do, we would use them better. We would not fall for their hallucinations. We would not use them for, I want to take the word frivolous back, because frivolous is not so bad. Like, these are really negative things. They're not just frivolous. So yes, universities have a lot of work to do in really opening people's eyes to the fact that this is not a cost-free exercise that we're all engaged in.
Yeah, and if I may follow up on this great question and the information from Irina, there is a big responsibility on all levels of the university. I think there is a responsibility at the governing level of the university, and making resources available to actually study this issue and make changes and adjustments as needed. But then also on the facilities technical side, there's a responsibility of the teachers, learners, and the staff at the university as well. So we need more of these conversations.
I think I can practically imagine that if I get invited to an AI teacher training, faculty training workshop, that before I go to that workshop, I will RSVP to the leaders of the workshop privately and say, let's talk about AI's negative consequences, and can we incorporate that into the workshop? I wouldn't go to the workshop and say that at the workshop to a person who's already prepared all the curriculum and the materials, but I could have a conversation with them before I go and maybe shape that workshop a little bit to include some of these ethical issues. So that's just an example of how anyone can affect something from within. And I imagine I'm going to get some of those invitations as faculty. In-room question?
So I have a question about the sort of business calculus that goes into deciding where they place these things. So you're talking about the example of your And so California famously has some of the highest energy costs in the country, and it's on water. And why can we see this expansion of data centers in places that are already water strained versus putting it somewhere like the Great Lakes region or the Northeast, where it's going to be colder, energy is cheaper, and there's more annual access to water? Like, what is the decision in place?
So first of
I'm
all,
going to repeat the question for everybody.
yes.
Why are we putting data centers in places like California when we could be putting them where we have high cost of energy and low amounts of water? Why don't we put them in the Northeast and near the Great Lakes region where it's going to be cooler longer with global warming coming from the bottom up, and also where there is more plentiful water?
So first of all, they are being built in the Great Lakes region and in the Northwest. So all of those places are seeing data centers go up with, again, different kind of consequences locally. There are issues with latency. They need data centers to be close to where they're being used. I'm not nearly technical enough to understand why, but that's one of the requirements. That's one reason why we have so many in Santa Clara right now. It's because of the tech concentration here. But it's not an either or. They're being built here and in all of those places. In China, they are building them underwater, trying to cool them that way. We are facing then, the idea of, warming up the oceans in order to cool data centers. I mean, there are so many interesting attempts to deal with these issues. But so far, the careful calculus, it's not even just where the data centers are sited. There's also the possibility of deciding which data center is being used when, so that you can use them when it's cooler outside. There's a lot that can be done to make this better. But because we're building so many of them so rapidly, all of these benefits of more efficient technology that is being developed are being completely, subsumed to the massive growth.
A quick question came in on chat. Is any of the water being used for all of this cooling recycled water? Or is most of it recycled?
Yes, some of it is recycled water, but especially in California, it has been really difficult to find out exactly how much. This is part of the sustainability promises. There are a lot of these promises that phase 2 will be recycled water, but no information on when phase 2 will start, or if then the phase 1 buildings will be also on recycled water, or will they continue on the potable water from the city. So there is a lot of thinking on using recycled water and efforts to put that in there. It's been hard to get the definite quantities of water involved, and I think transparency here would go a long way and also spur more of that innovation, and also spur more of the actual adaptation of these practices.
One more comment to the prior question. There's also a trade-off between places that have good energy, like clean energy, with solar, but don't have water. So some of the siting decisions are balancing those two things. And it can be really difficult, especially now that we're seeing, again, the federal government, canceling funding for a lot of clean energy efforts. So at the same time that we're saying we need all this energy, we are relying more and more on the dirtier, older sources of energy. And in places that have clean energy, like solar, often water is lacking.
There's an interesting project that's being planned at the Salton Sea, one of the hottest and driest areas in California, but which has geothermal and energy that they want to use for that, and obviously plenty of solar. And is being built as being more, sustainably innovative, forward thinking.
There's a little subculture forming in the Zoom group that I want to point out. They're sharing links of browsers that do not automatically put AI generated answers to your Google searches or your searches. One of them is Ecosia, and another one that you can opt out of. It's AI is on by default, but you can opt out of it. Is DuckDuckGo. So I want to thank the Zoom community for giving us those. And also in Google, If you type -AI at the end of your search string, it won't do the summary.
It
Also, if you include a strong swear word,
I was going to say,
it
it
won't
also used to not
do
include it if you
a summary.
swore as part of, but again,
You should swear
know,
more.
not in your university searches, right? But we shouldn't have to swear in order not to get AI over. But yeah.
Kristen, there's an
Let's have
in-room
another question here in the room. Want to raise your hand?
I'm curious whether the water used in the evaporative systems, is it corrupted or harmed in some way by being used for cooling, or does it just harmlessly evaporate back into the atmosphere?
Is there any harm to the water that's used in cooling systems? Does it evaporate back into the atmosphere?
So the evaporated water itself would be very clean. I don't know enough about any residuals because they're going through places to evaporate from, and they might potentially be absorbing things there. I haven't heard many concerns about water contaminations. I haven't read anything about that yet.
And are you thinking that you're hoping it would just fall to the ground and become part of the groundwater again? So just part of the great recycling system? I don't think it works that way.
No, not in hot and dry places. The air can absorb all this evaporated water, and there's so much capacity of the air to hold that it won't come down as precipitation.
We have time for one more question in the room, if someone would like to share. Yes, in the back.
Thank you so much for your time. So one thing that really stood out to me was when you mentioned how in Kabul the water supply is not set to last for the next 4 years or so. And given that I'm in a class about communication development and social change, we often talk about green technology and AI from a very Western perspective, given that the West or the global North does own a lot of these companies that produce this technology. And I guess because of that, there's kind of a lot of questions about who has the right to actually produce and interpret the data for their own benefit. So speaking about Kabul specifically and other countries in the global South, especially impacted by the environmental impacts of AI, how can we ensure that developmental projects related to environmental conservation can remain more locally owned and supported rather than being externally opposed by the West?
Yeah, so
I'm just going to repeat real quick. Sorry not to say all the subtleties of what you just mentioned. Thank you for your question. But how can we ensure that development projects take in the perspectives and needs of the local community when in general that is not how they are done?
And I think specifically the question was outside the US and specifically in the global South. And there are definitely lots of efforts to build locally and to build for local languages and to locate the data in, where people are actually creating it. I would point you to some interesting efforts by the Maori in New Zealand who are developing their own models based on the Maori languages and building their own data centers. There's also a great publication called Rest of the World, which has lots of articles about tech in other parts of the world, and we often hear about what's happening in the US, but it's super interesting. And they have had a number of articles about the environmental challenges with projects that are built in other countries and not just by American companies. You can have negative environmental impacts even if you're doing it locally and by the local government. So it really becomes, again, even in other countries, a question of environmental justice and who is doing the benefiting, who's doing the suffering, and how do we get the input from the people who are actually impacted negatively.
Wow, we are at time, everyone. Thank you so much for your generous attention, and I hope you're breathing. Please inhale and exhale. And our Zoom audience, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our speakers, Irina and Raicu. Let's give them a big hand.